All right, we are, this is an exciting new training for us. It's called Wetlands and Wildlife, Avoiding Environmental Impacts in the Floodplain. And we've got two great guest speakers with us today. We've got Corey King from NRCS that's going to start us off, and then we'll shift over to Jessi Tapp with Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. We're just trying to provide a more like intersectional perspective on other jurisdictions, permitting considerations that Nebraska's floodplain administrators need to be aware of.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. As Adele mentioned, I am Corey King. I'm the Wetlands Coordinator with NRCS. I'm based out of the state office here in Lincoln. I guess I'll give a kind of a quick brief background on myself. I've been with NRCS now for almost 5 years. It'll be 5 years in January. All that time has been here in Nebraska. I started out working in the Tecumseh field office for the Southeast Nebraska folks. You may have run into me before previously down there, possibly. But yeah, so I moved from there to the Lincoln field office, and now I'm in the Lincoln state office. But I'm originally from Missouri. And prior to coming to NRCS, I worked for a variety of other federal agencies, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, and USGS, among others. So that's kind of just a brief background on me. Now let me share my screen and we'll get going on my presentation. All right, can everyone see my screen all right? Perfect. Okay, so start with, obviously, so I'm representing NRCS and Wetland Compliance, the Wetland Compliance program of NRCS. With that, I should mention that should distinguish between several different divisions within NRCS that do different things. We have a separate division that handles watersheds. That's a completely separate group of people, and I can certainly forward you information on who to contact if you have a much larger watershed type question. And I also do not deal with like WRE, Wetland Reserve Program, and there's also Wetland CRP, if any of you are familiar with those programs. That's also a separate division from what I do as well. But if you do have a question about those things, I can certainly get you in contact with the appropriate person that would be able to answer your question. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide here. This is just going to be a brief introduction on wetland compliance for NRCS and kind of where we started and where we're at now. So in the 1980s, that's kind of where wetland compliance all started with NRCS. Some of you all, I'm sure, have been around long enough to remember the farm crisis of the 1980s, where, right, I mean, so many, of our small family farms were in serious danger of going under. And with that, the Food Security Act of 1985 was passed. And with that, with consideration on that, they had been doing the research and had been monitoring that 85% of wetlands have been lost across the entire continental US since the 18th century, give or take. Wetlands have been determined to be a vital aspect of the landscape and of our environment that are important for a variety of reasons. Obviously there'll be things that I know Jessi will touch on with, threatened and endangered species, that they're important habitat for those. They're also important as far as like the carbon cycle and carbon cycling those sorts of things as well. But so focusing in on, so the Food Security Act of 1985, that was passed December 23rd, 1985. For us, for NRCS, that's a kind of a magic date for us, because everything that was activities that were done prior to 1985 are all grandfathered in under our system. I'm not going to talk about labels. We use a whole laundry list of labels for our wetlands. It's not as simple as like the Corps of Engineers where it's just wet or it's not wet. There's no in between with them. For us, we have a whole slew of labels. I wasn't planning on talking about all our entire laundry list of labels today, but I can certainly answer questions later on if we have questions about labels or if that comes up. But anyway, so with the Food Security Act of 1985, there were a couple of different provisions that were included with that. There's what we call the Swamp Buster provision. There's also Sod Buster provision. So I'll talk about Swamp Buster first, and that's the most relevant portion of it to our discussion today. Swamp Buster is basically what it sounds like. It's essentially draining wetlands, right? It's the Swamp Buster provision is what ties wetland compliance to farm bill participants. And so what happens in it, and I'll talk about this in more detail in the coming slides, but farm bill participants are required to self-certify that they are following the wetland compliance rules and that they are not draining wetlands each year. That's essentially what the Swamp Buster provision says, is producers cannot drain wetlands without either prior approval or mitigating or so forth with there. Sod Buster is kind of a closely related component to that. It's more related to HEL, which is highly erodible land. I'm not going to talk about highly erodible land a lot today since it's not really relevant as far as the wetland discussion, but it's another provision that we also enforce as through the same process that we do Swamp Buster through. In Nebraska, we do have some special wetland types that are of interest, particularly playas. They're also, so potholes and precosins aren't so much in Nebraska, but they are special playas, potholes, the three, we call them the 3 Ps, right? PPP, playas, potholes, and precosins. Those wetland types all have special protection under the Food Security Act. And so the criteria for what you can and cannot do in those certain types of wetlands is a little more strict. So in Nebraska, just since we're focusing here, playas are the #1, which I'm sure most of you either work or have heard of the rainwater basin area. That's all playa lakes out there. And then there's the Central Table playas. There's what we refer to as the Todd Valley Playa Complex. That's up towards Saunders County and up that direction. And then there's the Southwestern Playa Complex, which is down out, not quite to the Panhandle, but the southwestern portion of the state. All right, we'll move on here. All right, so I'm going to talk specifically now about our NRCS process for wetland determination. So wetland determinations, we work very closely with our sister agency, the Farm Service Agency. What happens is all of our entire wetland workload is all generated by producers. So we don't generate our own workload, it's all done by request. So essentially what happens is a producer, comes into the office and suggests that they're going to do some sort of work, whether that be on a floodplain potentially or anywhere on their farm. And through that process, they request that we do a wetland determination on their farm. So with that, We then move on to the first step in that process is to do a preliminary wetland determination. We have an off-site procedure, which primarily consists of slide review. So we have aerial photography for almost every county in Nebraska, going back all the way to the 1930s. So we can look at all the history of that tract for a very extensive period of time. And typically we review somewhere in the ballpark of 5 to 10 years of imagery, possibly more in some cases, depending upon what the situation is. But so that's the first step with that. And when we issue a determination, and I'll show you what a map looks like for that in just a second. But when we issue a determination, it's not a permit or approval to do anything. We don't issue permits to producers. We essentially provide them with a document for their reference. We provide them with a map that then shows what types of wetlands, if they have wetlands on their property, what type they are based upon our Food Security Act labels. And then they are free to use that however they choose. We may advise them if they have questions about a certain label type or a certain situation. We may advise them that if they do certain activities that they would potentially be in violation of the wetland provisions. But we don't have any authority to tell a producer what they can and can't do on their property. We can just tell them that, you know, if you do this, you possibly could have a violation on your hands. And if that happens and we catch it, then we would potentially require you to fix it, right, to put it back the way it was, or to mitigate for it. Every determination that we issue comes with appeal rights. So a lot of times what will happen is if a producer doesn't agree with that determination, we will then do what we call a reconsideration, which essentially is we go out there again and look at it and take any concerns that producer may have as to why the original determination may have been inaccurate in their mind, or maybe there's something that the information that they have that we didn't consider on the preliminary. If they have additional information, then we would certainly take that into consideration in that stage. All right, here's an example of what a wetland determination map looks like for us. I've blocked out all the PII stuff on here, but typically this is a tract in Pawnee County, and this is not on a floodplain per se, but this is typically just, for example, what our maps look like. This one has a variety of labels on it. Obviously non-wet is self-explanatory. It's not a wetland. We have a W on here, which is that kind of bright blue color. We have some artificial on here. Usually those are farm ponds or things that have been man-made that were never previously wetlands. And for us, those types of wetlands don't have any restrictions, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the next couple of slides. Artificial wetlands may still fall under court jurisdiction. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. This one, it's got FWP on there as well, which FWP stands for farmed wetland pasture for us. It just means it's a wetland that was manipulated prior to 85, but it wasn't converted to the point where it's no longer a wetland, just has pre-85 manipulation. But so this is just an example of what the product that we give to a producer. And they may bring this to you, particularly if you're a floodplain administrator and they're going to be doing work on a floodplain. They may potentially show you a map that they received from us. Okay, so we'll keep going here. So talk a little bit more about reconsiderations. I already kind of touched on that a little bit, but essentially what happens there is producer either has new information that we didn't consider, or they just don't agree for whatever reason it may be. They have to present us with evidence as to why they don't agree, but it can't just be I don't agree. But so we service a fair number of those requests each year. Then we also have what we call NAT appeals, which is the next step beyond a reconsideration. It's an administrative appeal. I'm not going to go into extreme detail on that here. I deal with those. I'm the only person for NRCS that deals with NAT appeals. Essentially, at that stage, it's we're dealing with an administrative judge, and it's a paperwork review, and it gets. Those are few and far between, though. Those are typically ones where that producer just is not happy with the determination they got, and we end up going to that step. All right. So these are some other things that we also deal with. So we're whistleblower complaints. That's just where someone either usually anonymously calls in or writes in and, you know, tells us that there's a potential violation, which we then would potentially investigate. How that works is, and I have been I have had some of the, I think I'm sure I've talked to a few of floodplain managers that may be on this training with questions about that process. And it's perfectly fine for you all to submit whistleblower complaints. How that should work is, so FSA, Farm Service Agency, is the lead agency for processing those. It really is their program as well in compliance. NRCS just does the technical side. So we're the ones that go out and do the technical work. But at the end of the day, FSA is the agency that it's their program at the end of the day. And so a whistleblower complaint, if you say someone calls in or writes a letter, either way, that information is then sent to FSA, and they make the decision as to whether they're going to issue we call it a 569. It's just, that's just a reference to the name, the title of the form, but essentially it's a request to go verify wetland compliance on a tract. So then we would go out and verify yes or no, there's a violation or not. It would go through that process. And for you all as, you know, floodplain administrators and other folks that may have a vested interest, if you see a violation, that would be what I would, you know, that would be my advice to you would be to go to the local NRCS office in your county or the closest one to you. And that's where you would, you could either call them or you can certainly write them a letter as well, to request that we investigate a potential violation that you may run into out there. A few other things that we deal with, we do have what we call minimal effect agreements. A lot of these are where we've run a functional assessment. So functional assessment is just a way for us to essentially grade a wetland, right? It's the quality of the wetland. And with that process, you know, if it's a high quality wetland, then obviously there's going to be a higher bar for producers to get across if they want to do some kind of modification to it. But, and I'm sure as many of you know, most of the wetlands in Nebraska are far from pristine at this point. And most of them have had some sort of manipulation at some point in the past. I mean, there are a few pockets here and there. You can find some spots out in the sand hills that are still fairly pristine, but for the parts of the state that have been majority crop ground for a long time, most of the wetlands in those areas are nowhere close to what they may have been originally prior to settlers arriving in Nebraska. So we do minimal effect agreements. And those could potentially impact be on a floodplain potentially. So that would be something where A producer may also need a floodplain permit depending upon what they're doing. Some of the common activities are installing drain tile on a floodplain. That's a fairly common activity in certain parts of the state, especially along the Platte River or along the Elkhorn River. Those areas, it's a really common thing. Essentially with our agreements, what we do is we put in a provision in there that basically tells that producer that they are responsible for acquiring any other permits that they may need for that agreement. So we give them an agreement that has our language on it, and I said the last term usually is, please contact the Corps of Engineers if you need a clean water permit, or contact your local floodplain manager if you need a floodplain permit to do work. The landowner is the individual that's solely responsible for obtaining permits, and as a part of any agreements that we sign with landowners. We also do what we call scope and effect agreements. Essentially, this is for systems that have already been modified somewhat, maybe to be like cleaning out silt out of a linear wetland, something like that. Typically those aren't quite as complicated as minimal effects, but those are the types of situations. And if it's something on a floodplain, obviously they may need a floodplain permit as well for that, particularly if they're moving dirt. Okay, so keep going here. So another big part of what we do and I kind of talked a little bit about this earlier as well, but restoration and mitigation plans. So if a producer converts a well, and obviously they probably have a violation for your floodplain provisions for the state as well, on top of having a violation for us. But we don't enforce any of the state laws or provisions on that, but we will work with that producer to potentially put together a restoration plan for them and or a mitigation plan. And with that, and this kind of ties back into what I was just talking about with minimal effects and the scope and effect agreements. With that, there's always a provision in there. Usually it's the very last term of their agreement that they will once again, that they will communicate with either the Corps of Engineers if they need a Corps permit, or they'll communicate with any other governmental entity that they're required to by law to have a permit for. And once again, that's solely the responsibility of the landowner as far as our provision on it. And with that, we may advise them, hey, you should go talk to your local floodplain administrator, but beyond that, we don't follow up on it beyond that, other than to advise them that they should look into that if they need to. A couple of other topics here. So waters of the US, that's kind of a hot topic right now in general. Some of you all may have heard that the Corps of Engineers and the EPA are once again revising the definition on that. It's kind of a moving target, but as far as NRCS goes and how our interactions with that go, we have we call it an icon. It's a little triangle it's a green triangle with a black dot in the center of it. And it represents what we call PJW, which stands for Potential Jurisdictional Waters. We are going to start, in fact, that's a change that we're starting January 1st of next year. We're going to start putting those icons on our wetland determinations for areas that are obvious potential waters of the US. So for example, if a tract has, the Elkhorn River running through it, we may put that, instead of calling that a wetland, we're not going to do a wetland determination on that section of it. We're going to put that icon on there as a cautionary icon and then we'll have a note that goes along with that determination telling that producer that they should contact the Corps of Engineers to get a jurisdictional ruling on that. We do not have we don't make NRCS does not make jurisdictional rulings. That's strictly the Corps of Engineers. The only part that we have any oversight over are wetlands that are outside of the Corps' jurisdiction, which is most of them, to be honest. So as far as WOTUS goes, that's pretty much where our kind of authority ends, and that's where the Corps of Engineers and EPA, that's where their authority begins at that point. So just general relationship with other government agencies. So we do have some interagency workings with the Corps of Engineers, kind of what I've mentioned a little bit already. The Corps of Engineers may accept a wetland determination from us and use it for their purposes as well, potentially. They may not, though. It all depends on the individual situation, and even it may even depend upon the individual Corps biologist that's looking at it too. I don't pretend to speak for the Corps at all on that, and all I can say is that they may or may not accept a determination that we do as good enough for their purposes as well. So for questions on that, once again, I would always refer, if when folks ask me if this is good enough for the Corps, or if they need to consult with the Corps, I always tell them that I don't speak for the Corps, and if that's a major concern for you on a particular project that you're working on, then you should request a jurisdictional ruling from the Corps of Engineers. All right, move on here. Okay, so we'll start talking about a little bit where we overlap with floodplain management and with the Corps to a lesser degree here. So restoration plans, as I've already kind of mentioned, that's a potential area of overlap for us. Particularly if that restoration is being done on a floodplain, that's an area where that producer probably should also consult with their local floodplain manager. The same thing with mitigation as well. Essentially what mitigation is creating wetlands where there didn't used to be wetlands to replace something that individual does not want to restore. I can't really think of any good examples off the top of my head, but if someone wants to fills in something that used to be a wetland, perhaps they want to create a new wetland someplace else on their property. Obviously, if that's on a floodplain, once again, there's a good chance they would probably need a floodplain permit for that as well. And if it involves a potential waters of the US, right, it gets even more complicated, because then it probably involves a Corps permit potentially as well. But those are probably the two biggest areas where we overlap. And then of course, minimal effect exemptions. I kind of touched on that earlier, but depending upon what the project is, if it involves like a channel clean out of some sort, or trying to think of another example besides just channel clean outs. That's the most common one that we see, but trying to think what else. Tile is the other example. And both of those potentially would involve moving dirt on a floodplain if that wetland's in the floodplain area. So that would be another area where a floodplain permit may be necessary. The scope and effect, kind of the same deal. If they're wanting to move dirt on something, clean something out that's on a floodplain, that's another area of potential overlap. But the key thing with all of these items here, all four of these, is that it's the responsibility of that individual landowner to to work with their other government agencies to get the required permits. And a lot of times we won't sign off on their work if they don't have permits in some cases, depending upon what it is. If it's something that we know is likely to be waters of the US, a lot of times we'll tell them that we won't authorize their activity until they have a permit in place. So moving on here, kind of changing gears a little bit here. These are some of the other programs that we do. And I kind of talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but wetland reserve programs that potentially could be on a floodplain, I suppose. And with that, that's not something that I personally deal with, or that the compliance division, wetland compliance division deals with. So that's a completely separate division within NRCS that deals with that. And typically most of these aren't going to be on a floodplain, but there may be a situation that pops up that may be necessary. Watershed planning, the best example of that I can think of is think back to the 2019, all the 2019 flooding that we had. We have several programs that we do that are on the watershed scale that provide money to repair and to fix things, especially from natural disasters. Some of those programs may require a floodplain permit depending upon what the exact activity is. And then kind of the third thing is mitigation banking. And typically with this, we actually are just developing our very first mitigation bank in Nebraska for NRCS for farm bill wetlands. Some of you may have heard about the Westervelt project over by Utica and between York and Seward. That's a project that we vetted, but that was also a multi-agency project. So the Corps of Engineers was involved with that as well, as was Nebraska Game and Parks with that project as well. Those are some other areas that you could potentially run into, but less likely to be an issue. So I'll kind of change gears a little bit here, just kind of give you a little bit of a rundown on our staff. As of right now, we have, for NRCS, we have 17 dedicated wetland staff. We have 4 compliance specialists, 9 wetland biologists, and 3 soil scientists. We actually just got done hiring 7 new team members this last fiscal year. So our team has been growing considerably. And then we also work with resource soil scientists, particularly out in the western part of the state. Some of you may have worked with Chuck Markley or Angie Elg out in North Platte, potentially. They work with us as well. This here is a graph that shows kind of what our workload looks like for the last few years. Typically, as you can see by this, we receive somewhere between in the ballpark of 2,100 to 2,800 individual wetland requests a year for determinations. That number's been fairly steady the last few years, as you can see by the graph. It's different parts of the state kind of are hot spots at different times. Typically, the eastern portion of the state has always been the hot spot for wetlands. It makes sense because it's the wetter part of the state. But we are starting to see a lot more activity in the central part of the state, and particularly with tile contractors wanting to install tile and do other projects that involve manipulating wetlands potentially. So that's just kind of a look at what our workload has been. And I would anticipate that it's going to continue to be in the same ballpark in the future as well. With that, that's about all I had. I don't know if we want to take time to do I can do a little bit of Q&A here if we have time, or I don't know if you all want to save that to the end, Adele.
Yeah, thank you very much, Corey, for such an informative presentation and wide-ranging. Also, at this point, pivot over to Jessi Tapp with Nebraska Game and Parks to talk about threatened and endangered species in Nebraska and the environmental review tool that Game and Parks Commission has available. Okay, with that, Jessi, I'll let you take it away.
Hi, thank you, Adele. I'm hoping that the one person that was quite familiar is my staff that is also on the call today. All right. Oh, he's sending me messages now. Okay. All right. So I'm Jessi Tapp. I work for Game and Parks. My title is environmental specialist. I am a part of our environmental review team. And specifically responsible for reviewing projects involving streams and wetlands and larger landscape scale type projects such as pipelines and watershed improvements. I've been with Game and Parks for just over a year. I previously worked for Missouri Department of Conservation for about 6 years as a public land manager, managed a lot of wetlands, some prairies and savannas and that sort of thing. I've been in Iowa doing wetland easements. I've kind of been all over. My younger days, I actually spent a couple of summers in Nebraska on the Platte River, monitoring terns and plovers and small mammals. And I am a Kentucky native. So if anybody's been staying on top of the news where the tornado hit, that's where I'm from. So yeah, lots of people back home are picking up fragments of their lives right now. So it's pretty devastating. Hard to watch from up here, even though we had our own little close calls here yesterday. But so yeah, so let's get moving on to the presentation. I'm going to cover today an overview. Here's an overview of what I'm going to cover today. So a little bit about some of our endangered and threatened species. The law that protects these species, our state law, which is called the Nebraska Non-Game Endangered Species Conservation Act. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about how we handle consultation and reviews for impacts to our listed species. All right, so why should we protect these species? Why should we protect any species? There are many species that are bioindicators of the health of our surrounding landscape. So if certain species aren't doing well, that means that something is wrong with their ecosystems. It's a heads up for us to try to fix things. By protecting wildlife and plant species, we're also helping to protect the diversity of our ecosystems. So a more diverse ecosystem is always more stable and resilient and able to bounce back from things like diseases or natural disasters. We also want to, for scientific purposes, monitor and collect data because the more we are able to learn about nature, the more we're able to benefit as humans in various ways. And by protecting species, we are preserving Nebraska's natural heritage and keeping these wonderful resources around for the benefit of future generations. And people enjoy interacting with nature because it reminds us that we are part of something bigger. It allows us to escape from our daily struggles and sometimes monotonous jobs and chores and stuff in our life. So some of the reasons for decline of wildlife species and plant species and others, habitat loss and fragmentation. Humans have had a major impact on the landscape. And so we are seeing that in decline of wildlife and other populations. We've put a lot of pesticides on the landscape, which have taken a toll on important food sources such as insects and have had some unintended impacts on non-target species. And many species are sensitive to water quality, so runoff from pesticide use or just sediment from the landscape, oil, things from like construction. There's a lot of regulations that are included in discharge permits, the NPDES permits that require you to regulate what might has the potential to flow into nearby waterways. So land uses that require significant annual use of water. They have depleted flows in streams and rivers that are home for wildlife, and so that's impacted some of our river or stream dwelling species. Poachers and of course overharvest or overcollection can also exacerbate population decline due to the issues I just mentioned. We do have a species that is a candidate for listing, Blanding's turtle. That one gets collected a lot for wildlife trade as pets. And just a plug, if you do suspect that a person or a project is impacting a protected species, you can take action by taking steps to legally document any helpful details, such as the presence of a protected species on a site, and then reporting that information to your local conservation agent, because they are the ones that really pursue these types of issues. All right, so you've probably heard of the Federal Endangered Species Act, which protects listed species all across the United States. Nebraska has our own state law that protects species within our state, including but not limited to those that are federally listed. So to clarify, all federally listed species are also state listed in Nebraska, but not vice versa. So we do have some species that are protected by our state law, but are not protected by our federal law. So that means federal listing means that a species is declining throughout its entire range. And then a state listing is specific to a species that is declining within our state. So it may be, maybe a species not federally listed, but is present in other states, but the population in Nebraska isn't doing well for one reason or another. So the act of listing a species as threatened or endangered means that we can prohibit the take of said species. And take is defined very specifically in the law. It includes things like harassment, harm, and of course killing. And these laws apply to everyone. So everybody has to adhere to these laws. And then in Nebraska, we have a total of 31 state listed species, which includes plants, animals, fish, insects, and mussels. And as you probably noticed, I've included pictures of them throughout this presentation. You can find a current list of these species on our Game and Parks website, so outdoor.nebraska.gov. In regards to T&E species in floodplains, you might find the plant pictured here, Western Prairie Fringed Orchid, or another orchid called Small White Lady Slipper in certain areas of the state. American Burying Beetle likes moist sites. Northern long-eared bat, of course, if there's trees. Western Massasauga likes crawfish burrows. So if you've got those in and around in certain areas in the state, very, very specific areas of the state, so southeast mostly, and some in central eastern areas. Whooping crane, that's a popular one you probably have heard of. All along the Platte River, twice a year, you might find them during migration. There's a couple of others, particularly around Lincoln. If you're in a saline marsh, you might find Salt Creek tiger beetle or saltwort. And then, of course, there's potential impacts to aquatic fish species. If there's big projects in floodplains, of course, they're adjacent to rivers and streams, and there could be potential discharges or something that might disrupt their habitat. All right, so now there is specific language within NESCA, short for the Non-Game Endangered Species Conservation Act. I'm just going to shorten it there because it's a mouthful. So there's specific language that requires state permitted or funded actions to consult with the Game and Parks to ensure listed species are not impacted. This mirrors language within the Endangered Species Act at the federal level, which requires all federally funded or permitted actions to consult with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm going to talk a little bit about consultation here. So what does consultation look like? We typically go through a process that involves working with project proponents or project sponsors to develop a way to avoid take, protect sensitive habitats, and still allow projects to move forward. So for example, we might use the knowledge of a species life history to develop measures that a project can adhere to avoid disturbing a species during a critical time frame. So one of our most common conservation measures that we use is to avoid cutting down trees during a specific time during a bat's life. So our northern long-eared bat is our listed bat species. And they raise their pups generally through June and July. So we might request that a project avoids cutting down trees during that time frame to avoid harming or killing any pups that can't fly at that time. So this process is designed to not only protect species, but also protect project proponents, and including our other state agencies. We also comment on projects that only have federal funding or a permit through a process outlined in the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, that you might have heard of, which that process requires that federal actions solicit public comments, including state agencies in the planning process. So some examples of projects that we might consult on in floodplains and elsewhere are pipelines, power lines, transportation. I know I've got some DOT guys here. We actually have our own an agreement with DOT so that their own biologists can review a lot of these projects and save us a lot of trouble, and they can mitigate or develop measures on the front end before it even comes to us. And they may not even need our consultation. Residential projects, wastewater treatment facilities, see a lot of those in floodplains, dams, levees, and even habitat restoration projects, so like wetland easements. These types of projects, especially in floodplains, will often require a federal 404 permit, which is required for projects that might place fill in waters of the United States. Those permits also require a state 401 water quality certification. And so that state nexus there is what requires that we do state consultation on these permits. And then a lot of projects will require a national pollutant discharge and elimination system. So I said NPDES earlier, that's the full term. You might have heard them as a construction stormwater permit or an industrial stormwater permit. So if there's potential for stormwater runoff or discharge of pollutants into surface waters, particularly most common is projects that are greater than an acre in size. There's potential for, like, during rain events, for water to for the rain to wash large amounts of soil or maybe mechanical fluids or whatever into nearby waterways. So sometimes both permits are needed, both a NPDES permit or a 404/401 water quality certification are needed based on the project size and location. All right, so we have this nifty tool called Cert, and it makes our lives so much easier. What is Cert? It's a web-based tool, and it expedites Game and Parks environmental reviews for impacts to threatened and endangered species. So this tool uses a combination of Nebraska species data collected by biologists and project activities and their potential impacts, conservation conditions that we have developed ahead of time in anticipation of a lot of these project activities, and then other information to determine if a project's location might impact listed species. So people can input their project information, such as a boundary and project activities, and it'll use all this information to develop a report. Without this tool, it might take anywhere from 30 to 60 days for us to complete project reviews. With it, most people can get a review back in 5 to 10 minutes, and they may never even have to talk to us. So it's made our lives so much easier, and we can put a lot more effort into more complex projects and making sure that they are considering, impacts in a more detailed way. So, like I said, project proponents can draw or upload a project boundary into the tool, provide additional information about the project activities and a description, and then they will get a report back with information about the results. So this is the website, the login page. The website is cert.outdoornebraska.gov, and Michelle will put all this stuff in the chat here at the end for easy access for you guys. To use the tool, to submit a project, you have to create an account. Now, just to look around in the map, you don't have to create an account. You can go in and look at species ranges and other information that we have up for everybody to use. I'm not going to go into how to do this today, because that's a whole nother 30 minutes to an hour. But there is a help tab that has user guides that can help you get through creating and submitting a project for environmental review, and a lot of other additional information regarding the tool. For those that might have to look at a cert and determine, whether or not they filled it out correctly, or figure out, what were the potential impacts of a project. So if you see a cert submitted with like a permit, there's going to be 3 possible outcomes on these reports. So there's an overall results section, and you're going to see one of these 3 results. One of them is what we call for short may affect, which means that further consultation is necessary. The project should have reached out to us to further investigate whether or not the project is going to impact a species. The second one is another may affect. It's the type of may affect result where the Cert tool has determined that there's potential for a listed species to be in and around that site, or maybe there's potential for suitable habitat. And so it's going to provide questions, and it's basically asking for more information to determine whether or not there's impacts. And then there's the no effect result, which essentially means that no further action is necessary. Don't need to do anything else regarding game and parks. All right, so let's take a look at some specific things within these reports. So a may affect result where further consultation is necessary is going to show this language up here at the top. Because when I say may affect, it doesn't actually say may affect. It says potential impacts on listed species may occur. Then it tells the project proponent to email a copy of that report, a signed copy of the report, and a request a review from us. And then they have to sign at that certification section. So that's all they have to do, but it's going to look similar to a no effect, but particularly that overall results is where it differs, or that language requiring consultation. So here is an example of language that's included within a may affect where more information is needed. So in the overall results, it's going to say more information is needed, refer to the following sections. And then there's going to be questions regarding species and trying to determine whether or not there's suitable habitat for those species within the project area or adjacent to the project area. So for this example, you've got northern long-eared bat. It's asking if there's bat habitat. They will use trees. They might also use bridges, culverts, and even old abandoned buildings, or even buildings that people live in. So you answer that question.
Hey, Jessi. Can
Yeah.
I just jump in here? Is any person qualified to answer these questions, or do you need to be a biologist, arborist, botanist?
It's recommended that if you don't know the answer to these questions, that you reach out to us or you reach out to a consultant. A lot of big projects will have a consultant that has biologists on board that can answer these questions. Some of these, it's really up to the project to make sure that they're answering these correctly. So while we can't require that a qualified biologist answer these questions, it's in your best interest to make sure you're answering them correctly, because you're the one that's on the hook for ensuring your project doesn't impact these species. So hopefully that makes sense. And you can see below the question, there's a conservation measure there that I mentioned earlier about no removal of trees during that period. So that's a general example of what's going to show up for those. If you check yes, so if there is suitable habitat, then you have a conservation measures agreement that shows up right after that in the report. If you check yes, you're going to want to check option 1 to agree to that conservation measure, and then sign that. So the project proponent is going to be the person that checks these, or it might be the consultant for the project that signs this. So you see down below, there's also an option 2. If option 2 is selected, which means if you don't know the answer to the question, or for whatever reason the project cannot adhere to those conservation measures, check option 2, and then further consultation is required because we have to figure out a different way for this project to move forward. All right, so the last one is the no effect that I mentioned. You can see that the language says specifically that it is unlikely that this project will negatively impact listed species. So make sure that all your information is correct, and then sign the certification section. So that's why I said it looks similar to that first one, the may affect, is all you have to do is sign, but there's no extra step here. So you can use this signed report to submit with any permit applications. And then in each report, of course, our contact information is provided. And then if you need consultation on federally listed species, if there's a federal nexus, there's also contact information for Nebraska's field office for Fish and Wildlife Service. And that's all I have. That's all I have, guys. I know I'm running a little bit over, but if people have questions, I'm willing to stick around. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, I was just going to add a couple things based off Jessi's presentation. They kind of overlap with NRCS as well, that I may not have touched on maybe as well as I should have. But so when we do especially mitigation and restoration plans, when I say we, NRCS requires consultation with potential T&E species as well. A lot of times our plans will have provisions written into them that correspond to some of the things that Jessi just talked about. For example, if someone's going to be doing tree removal around a wetland, we may require them to do it during a certain time of the year, right? To avoid migratory birds and or bat migration as well. So that's some of the things we require on our end as well. Another example, Massasauga, a lot of times before we'll sign off on a project, and usually for us, it's Pawnee County. I think it's the only county it's been recorded in, to my knowledge at least. But if there's a project that involves dirt movement around a wetland in Pawnee County, I can tell you for sure that we require a crawfish burrow survey before we will sign off on it. And of course, there may also be, okay, I see a question in chat. I can answer that question if it's relevant here. Yeah, so I'll talk about that real quick. So for certification of our determinations, our determinations are considered certified forever once we issue them. So unless Congress changes the law between now and the next farm bill we have, a certified determination issued by NRCS is considered certified forever into perpetuity, essentially. Depending upon when the determination was done, it may or may not be certified though. And what I mean by that is we have some additional dates that are important, which you all really don't need to know per se. Typically what happens is a producer will come to us, they'll ask about it. And then we will, as part of their request, we will review, right? Yeah, we'll review any previous determinations that are on file for us. And if it is certified, we will obviously let you know that if it is certified or not. But kind of the magic date for us for certification is actually November of 1990. And the reason for that being is there was a new farm bill so farm bills are passed every 4 to 5 years, and they pass essentially a new version of it. Most of the time, the wetland provisions, swamp buster provisions all remain the same and nothing changes. But sometimes they decide to change things associated with that. And 1990 was one of the farm bills. It was the first farm bill that was passed that modified the 1985 farm bill. And with that, it changed the way compliance was tied to compliance to crop certification is what happened at that time. And with that, it also required us to have appeal rights. So a lot of determinations that are older. So you may have seen a determination that was done by NRCS, at that time would have been SCS, right? Soil Conservation Service, from like 1987 or something like that. It's old, and a lot of times those are not certified. But with that, it's the producer's responsibility to request a what we call a 1026 request. It's just, let's say it's just the lingo on the paper, what the paperwork says, but there's just a request for a wetland determination. And with that review process, we will then check to see if there are any existing certified determinations on file for that tract. Hopefully that answers your question in chat there. Yeah, so I just wanted to mention those couple of things, especially on T&E species. A lot of times, and I know there also are some consultants on here in this call as well. If any of you all work with wetland mitigation, with any of our producers, that's a requirement for a third-party mitigation plan for us, is that you account for any T&E species that may be present on that tract. And also another component that I didn't talk about in a lot of detail is cultural resources as well. So if you find an old Indian artifacts or some other Native American type of settlement, or some old settlement burial mounds, there's all kinds of weird things you can run into potentially that we would require you to have in those plans as well. But I would say this: if you do have to be working on a third-party mitigation plan that's for a farm bill participant, typically that's something that I work with those individual consultants personally. So if you have questions on those, just let me know and we can certainly take a look at it. But that's all I had to add though, really, unless there's other questions.
Great, thank you very much, Corey. And this reminds me that I probably should have mentioned earlier on in this training session that so often in the floodplain development permitting scope, we're thinking it's a structure, the structure needs permitting. But in floodplain development regulations in Nebraska, any earthwork, any cut or fill activities is also that occurs in your special flood hazard area is subject to a floodplain development permit, regardless of the presence of a structure. So something such as installing tile could potentially require a floodplain development permit if it's occurring in the floodplain.
Right. The other thing I would add real quick, kind of related to that, is for us, we may issue a determination of no wetlands, and it may be on a floodplain. So essentially what that may mean for that individual producer then is they may still need to contact their floodplain administrator for their county to do a floodplain permit. But as far as NRCS goes, we're out of it at that point if we've called it non-wet. So that's something that I'm sure a lot of producers probably don't understand, is that just because they're kind of free of NRCS's kind of scope doesn't mean that they may fall under, you know, a floodplain issue or game and parks issue as well. So,
Corey, I'm wondering if you might take just a couple more seconds to provide folks with a conception of wetland. I realize that some folks I do talk to have an image of a wetland that's a little bit limiting in terms of the broad spectrum of wetlands that are actually legally defined and under your purview. Do you mind, or is that possible for you to sort of paint a picture of things to look for or consider as wetland?
sure, yeah, I can talk a little bit about that, or at least the criteria that we use. That may be a better way to talk about it. I mean, the easy thing to start out with is it's the picture that's behind you there. I mean, that's like your prototypical, what most people think of when they think of a wetland, right? Sandy
Right.
water, cattail, bulrush, you know, ducks and geese flying around. And those may be wetlands in a lot of cases. That's what a lot of folks think of as your prototypical wetland. But in Nebraska, most of the wetlands that we delineate do not look like that. So for our criteria for what constitutes a wetland, it has to meet 3 criteria for us. This is for NRCS only. So this doesn't work for all the other agencies. Each agency kind of has its own criteria. So I want to put that caveat out there. But so for us, we look for 3 things. It's got to have hydrophytic vegetation, so vegetation that likes wet environments. You know, cattail and bulrush are your common examples, right, of something that's really, really wet. But reed canary grass is another one that's you find it all over the place, and it's actually what we call a FAC wet plant. It occurs in what tends to occur in wetter areas in general. It doesn't mean it's a wetland necessarily. It just means it's a sign that it could be, depending upon what else is going on there. Pennsylvania smartweed's another plant that's a common plant that you'll see it grows in wet areas, but it also grows in some more upland areas as well. And that's a pretty common thing where we have plants that, the best way to say it is plants can lie to you, put it that way. Because sometimes they can indicate that it's a wetland, sometimes it's not. It's not always a wetland because there's a lot of wet plants that can grow in drier areas. But anyway, so hydrophytic veg is one component. The next component is hydric soils. So it's soils, the loose definition of hydric soils are soils that formed under wet conditions. The Food Security Act definition is basically soils that support predominance of hydrophytic vegetation. That's the Food Security Act definition of hydric soils. Essentially, to identify those, we use either soil survey, so web soil survey. You all may be familiar with that. You can use that to identify hydric soils. It's one way. Or if we go on site, then we do a field investigation and we look for different field indicators of hydric soils. One of the most common things that we look for, especially in Nebraska, is what we call redoxomorphic features. Now, it's a big word there, but essentially what that means is, to make it a little more simpler, is when you have soils that are in wet, either saturated or inundated, what happens then is all the pore space in there is filled up with water. So on a normal dry upland soil type, you have oxygen exchange through the soil. Everything, all the minerals and things kind of stay in place. What happens though, when you have water and all those pores are filled with water, minerals start to leach through the soil. So typically, a lot of times, and especially in Nebraska, one of the things we look for is iron leaching through the soil. And that's for redoxum. That's iron, and it'll look kind of like rust, right? That's when I talk to producers that have no idea what I'm talking about. I basically explain it as it's rust. It's the same process, in fact, that causes rust is what causes redoxomorphic features to form in the soil. So that's one very common example. Now there are several other indicators that we use. That's just one easy example, but we have a whole field manual that goes through field indicators for hydric soils. And then of course the third component is hydrology. So we have to have water. Whether that be saturation or inundation, those are two most obvious things. There's some other things that aren't as obvious though. For example, we may have to dig a soil pit, and if it starts filling up with water, then we may say it has a high water table, right? If we run into water within 2 feet of the surface, that can be an indicator of high water table. There are other indicators, geomorphic position, just the position on the landscape. Does it make sense? You're standing out there, you're looking at it going, does it make sense that water would go to this location or not? Typically it's the lower positions on the landscape. Those are just an example of some of the things we look for. But as long as it meets all three of those criteria, it potentially meets criteria as a wetland for NRCS.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for indulging me on that question. If folks don't mind staying on just a little bit longer, I've got one question for Jessi, just to clarify for folks. The relationship of the species considered under NESCA and the report that Game and Parks produces, is it fair to say that it can also serve as a report regarding potential impacts on nationally listed species? So if it's nationally listed, it will be captured in your report, but not necessarily the other way around. Not all state will be captured in a report on federally listed species.
Right. So Fish and Wildlife Service does have their own tool. It's called IPAC, but it does not include state listed species. So what a lot of people do is use our Cert tool if they have a both state and federal nexus in their project. They'll use our Cert tool and get a report, and it also includes the federal listing status for those species. So like I said, all federally listed species are state listed, so they're going to be included. And we have that indicated in there so that for your information, if you do need to consult with Fish and Wildlife Service, you can use that Cert report, that signed Cert report, and then send it to Fish and Wildlife Service with additional project information for your consultation with them.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
Great. That's good to know that it can serve as those two consultation applications. All right, no further questions, and thank you for indulging me with my questions. Thank you everyone for sticking around as we went well over time, but it was so informative. And yeah, if you have any follow-up questions, again, the contact information was in the chat, and feel free to reach out to any of us.